Hello, welcome. This is Dan Housman here from Graticule with the Novel Cohorts podcast. I have the pleasure of meeting today with Melissa Haendel from the University of North Carolina. Um, we've worked on various projects relating to the N3C, and there's some very exciting things going on around rare disease that we wanted to talk about. Maybe first, it would be great for everyone to get an introduction to Melissa, and I'll let her describe a bit of the work she's done on national initiatives and other things relating to patient data for these kinds of areas.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's really wonderful to be here today with you. Um, I have a little bit of a circuitous background in having been trained originally as an early gene jockey, developmental biologist, molecular genetics, and ended up working at a database where I was responsible for structuring phenotypic data from the zebrafish and devised a method to compare phenotypic information from model organisms and compare that to humans. And thus was born a consortium called the Monarch Initiative, which has for the last 15 years or so developed standards and technologies to leverage a wide variety of data sources in order to help improve the diagnostic efficacy of variant prioritization algorithms for improving rare disease diagnoses. Since then, I've also led several national initiatives, including the National COVID Cohort Collaborative, and more recently, the Center for Linkage and Acquisition of Data for the All of Us Research Program, where we have collected and harmonized a wide variety of electronic health record data sources and linked those data sources to other data sources like claims data or mortality data or geocoded environmental and social data. And through both of those kinds of initiatives, we can really start to paint a picture of rare disease longitudinal characterizations to try to better understand the journeys that rare disease patients go through and start to really pick apart how we might have earlier interventions in their diagnostic odysseys. And so that's what I believe we're here to talk about today.
Great. Why don't we talk a little bit about the problem? What are we talking about? And I'll maybe start a bit from the pharma side, and I can ask your opinion as well from your perspective. Because we work with a number of life sciences companies, and they come to us with this challenge of um, it's very hard to execute research on rare disease um, because the patient populations are hard to find, and often they're undiagnosed. And if they are diagnosed, they may not yet have structured information the way you see it in a common disease. So it's easy enough to find someone with a ICD code for diabetes. But you get into these rare diseases with genetic components, there's often a lot of the key information for their product or their study relates to a certain genetic marker. Or those patients don't get a diagnosis because there's no treatment yet. Because there's no point in putting a diagnosis in the medical record if there's no next step at the level of how to work. And the end impact is a lot of inefficiency and a lot of missed opportunities to either get a study done effectively um, or after a product's already in the market with an FDA approval to have uptake where patients benefit. And so we're keenly interested in how to solve that. And I'd say the extra piece which makes this hard in rare disease is implementing anything that works is hard to scale because you got little bits and pieces at each site, and there may only be 10 patients, 50 patients, 100, 300 patients will benefit from putting in new infrastructure. And so is the juice worth the squeeze problem half the time at any given place?
Yeah.
So there's no solution yet to all this. And I could probably go on and on with in the real world data world, it's also hard to do research because you're looking at 400 patients out of a database of 100 million and you're paying for a database of 100 million. And so even the business aspects of how to operate efficiently are hard. Um, so that's what we see a lot of. I don't know what you see on your side from the academic medical centers, government funded research, but I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems in there. And I think the meeting in San Francisco, which the ARPA-H new government agency focused on sort of high risk, high reward research, had a performers day for potential applicants of this program, which is focused on building a really robust data set for over 2,700 rare diseases for each rare disease, collecting data about a number of different patients that have that rare disease and using that to help people build diagnostic models. And the meeting was unfortunately canceled, but the community met anyway. And it turned out to be a really amazing event in the sense that the community really came together and talked about many of the issues that you're talking about. The severe degree of fragmentation, the lack of specialty expertise availability, challenges with insurance reimbursement, challenges with coding systems not existing, challenges with not having the ability to actually recognize rare disease patients in the EHR and lack of access to trials. So many of those same issues really kind of came to the forefront in that context, and the community wrote a really wonderful kind of community position paper that came out of that. So be well worth sharing with your listeners. I do think that, in general, there are kind of two sets of problems. One is a lack of knowledge about rare diseases because these patients are rare. We know very little about the rare diseases. They're often not studied very much on the basic research side either. And then the second aspect is that patients with a rare diseases information is lacking in their health record, and information about each patient is fragmented across the landscape. And the rarity of patients also means it's hard, as you mentioned, to find information about those patients, to have enough information to sort of even see a clinical signature that's good enough to then find the next patient. And so those are two separate sets of problems that intersect, but that we've been trying to chip away at. And I think with some of the momentum we're seeing now across the community, both with the ARPA proposal, but also more generally in the rare disease community, I think progress is finally starting to be made. The Monarch Initiative has focused on integrating just knowledge and data about rare diseases that we don't collect in the context of the electronic health record. So a lot of rare disease patient characteristics are not things that are billable, attributes. So we don't bill for having characteristics like, widely spaced eyes, but that might be a very defining characteristic biologically for being able to diagnose a patient with a specific rare disease. And so we're really trying to sort of, and sometimes that information is in the notes, but a lot of times it isn't. And so it takes getting to a specialty clinic for someone to actually document those kinds of characteristics, to then use those characteristics to compare against the basic research data and other knowledge sources. And so there's this mismatch between really needing to think about diagnostics and characterization of patients with rare diseases from a biological perspective, which is not really what our electronic health record systems and our standard clinical encounters are really designed to do. And so bringing those two worlds together is one of the main areas of focus of our community. The second thing has to do with this fragmentation of electronic health record information as it stands. And when I teach, I often ask my students a trick question, which is, how many undiagnosed patients do we have in our electronic health record data warehouse? And of course, the answer is 0, because everyone must get a diagnosis. But it's because for billing purposes, more generalized codes are used in order to provide care. And oftentimes, not as only are the codes more generalized, but they might be exactly wrong, because there's the clinician might know that if they choose a specific code, that might get the patient the care and the insurance coverage that they need. And so we're capturing data wrongly about rare disease patients. We have estimated that approximately 80% of rare diseases don't have an ICD code, and have worked really hard with many different communities, developing different rare disease terminologies and knowledge bases to build a reconciled terminology of rare disease codes that can be integrated with ICD, with SNOMED, and within EHR systems, and have been working with the intelligent medical objects company in order to deliver that Mondo terminology of rare disease codes that links back to organizations like OMIM and Orphanet and other rare disease experts, so that we can actually start getting the right rare disease codes into the electronic health record. Now, that does not solve the billing problem, but it would potentially, aid the longer term strategy that you all need to find patients that have a specific rare disease and who would not be so miscoded. And they could be doubly coded. They could be coded for their billing code that's, um, a cardiac condition not otherwise specified, alongside with their very specific rare disease code, so that there's new ways of querying EHR data and coding patients that have rare diseases. And so really kind of working at that end to just improve the overall data that's actually in the electronic health record and the way in which we code rare disease patients.
And back to the network problem, like sort of the scale up of, even if we could solve this, imagine it just UNC, how would we solve this in the United States? I know you've had this incredible work that you did during COVID to bring together lots of institutions, as well as the work on All of Us, which is another national initiative. How do you see that playing out? And maybe in the work, because I was a bit involved, but you were much more involved in the response to this ARPA-H grant. How do you think a network can play out? Is there a rapid path to a large number of health systems adopting something that will make something work for identifying patients, or even just contributing data to do useful diagnostic work on these populations?
Well, there's definitely, the philosophy of it takes a village. And I think, rare disease patients are some of the most motivated, communities in the world. And so they really, spend a lot of time driving around with their, suitcases full of electronic health record PDFs printed out, and have a very hard time getting access to even to their own data. So I think they're really an important force to help make change for how this is done. I think, fundamentally we have very just recently within the Center for Linkage and Acquisition of Data, the CLAD for the All of Us program, worked with eHealth Exchange, which is a national health information network that has allowed us to, for the first time, tap into those EHR data exchange systems that are present for care purposes for the first time for research at a national level. And this is very exciting because with an individual patient's consent, we can go out and get all their EHR data through those health information networks. And so that really sort of creates a much better longitudinal record. And then also with the patient's permission, we can also link it to other important data like claims data. Once we have all of that picture, we can start to really characterize, so let's say there's only 10 patients with a given rare disease in our country. But if we can get all the data about each of those 10 patients, we can really build computable phenotypes that would help identify those patients within the electronic health record and provide clinical decision support to even general practitioners to say, hey, your patient has characteristics that look like it might be one of these, ultra rare diseases. You should either refer them to this type of specialist, or here's the next lab that you should order, and really just provide that kind of clinical decision support at the point of care, no matter where that patient may be being seen for care. And often the problem with patients like that is if they don't get their care at a, more sophisticated diagnostic center, like at an academic medical center, it often takes many years before general practitioners out in the sort of what I call the real world, recognize them as potentially needing that type of care, if at all. And so we really need to be able to put the patient back together again and go out and get all the data about each patient, especially the rare disease patients, but also, control patients and patients with common diseases so that we can, find the needle in the haystack and be able to find those patients that folks like yourself might need for a given clinical trial. They're out there. We're just not finding them because we don't have, enough of a complete record about each one, and they're not coded in any way that's, so obvious to find them.
So we at Gratitude, we look like a CRO or look like a technology company with the pharma groups. We have a network of health systems already set up to do different kinds of things directly in Epic or directly in other EHRs for either patient ID or HRDDC. And the kind of question I think sponsors will ask us, and so I'll ask on their behalf back to you in the academic world. Um, what does a sponsor need to do to make a big network of sites get excited to be able to collaborate? What do you think is the missing ingredient to make something happen here in rare disease? And I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but I'm thinking, what do you want to see from the the life sciences med device world to come towards you?
I mean, I think, for these, very small populations, obviously just finding them and having, really good, ascertainment and retention, and really thinking about it, more as a partnership with those communities, as opposed to, larger trials where, they're just, patients obviously are important, but there is enough of them that there's not so much special communication or special education that's needed. And so I think that's where, so that's part of it. And I know that's kind of a fuzzy answer, but recognizing that each patient community and the sort of diagnostic and care odysseys that these patients go through are really hard. And recognizing that they actually have to be partners in designing the studies and partners in making sure that those patients are really sort of deeply engaged in the studies. I think those patient groups are incredibly powerful, as I mentioned at the beginning. From the healthcare perspective, these are often patients that are hard to care for, have poor outcomes, and are expensive. And so the healthcare systems are also motivated to really help these patients as well and want to do something about them. And they need it to be easier. They need it to be easier to find the patients. They need it to be easier to interact with the patients. And they want to be able to track outcomes for any of these interventions that are going on for a trial or any other research study. And so I think, also just sort of thinking about the technologies that can be deployed at the point of care that can help with that also sort of reinforces this idea of the patients as collaborators and the healthcare systems as collaborators in the process of doing a rare disease trial. And I think we just have to really think about the way in which we do studies in rare disease patients a little bit differently than the way that we do with much more common diseases. There's just has to be a lot greater investment in those relationships, but with great dividends. This is a little bit of an analogy, but I happen to be on the advisory board for the ECHO program, which is a national pediatric observational study, and they also do trials in those kids across the country, and it's mostly rural kids. They have 100% retention rate in those kids, and it's because the families that have those kids are so invested in being part of research. And I think that's the kind of sentiment that we need to have with these rare disease groups. Once they're identified and participating in a study, that they're really deeply engaged in that way and feel like they're, kind of co-designing and co-driving the research. And that's where I think there's not been as much experience for many pharma companies in doing that kind of partnership model.
And and do you think that you or you plus the network that built out things like N3C and all of us would be able to respond to, we were trying to run a study, we want to have 500 patients in an RCT. Can those groups help find them and use some of
So
the existing EHR collaborations, governance? I mean, I know how hard it is to get 100 institutions, everyone to look at it together to solve a problem.
I mean, I think there are policy changes needed nationally in order to make this easier. Organizations like the N3C are not allowed to re-identify or recontact patients, so that's a dead end for that kind of a study. However, the All of Us research program is a consented study, and they have been talking quite a lot about partnering with pharma for recruitment purposes and would have the ability to do that. And I think that's a wonderful idea. That's also a really great cohort because it's that cohort is, not so much pediatric. They're just starting a pediatric programs, but otherwise it's very socioeconomically varied across all states, and so it's a really good representative cohort. However, it's also not that big, so it's their goal is to get up to 1 million participants. So we've got to find ways to scale beyond that for rare disease. That's not enough for rare disease. And that's where, these, kind of policy changes and also use of the health information networks for research purposes could potentially come into play. There are other organizations that are also harmonizing data, like Truveta, that could also be partnered with. But ideally, this type of data harmonization for the purposes of doing computable phenotyping, finding patients and recruiting them to trials would be a public service utility, not unlike electricity. It should be, government regulated, but a private industry where we actually have the connectivity that we need. Some may say that, HL7 Fire is going to get us there because we're going to have all this great interoperability. But what I have seen is that people can push data and various ways into Fire. It is improving things, but it doesn't create the policies that allow the actual querying and sharing and harmonization across different organizations that are actually needed in order to find the patients and recruit them for a trial. So there's a big leap that needs to be taken, but I think we're actually there in terms of the technologies that need to be in place. What we're not there with are the policies and the governance.
I know you have to go soon. I mean, I was going to ask one other question about, in that ARPA-H grant, there was definitely a thread of AI, ML, and what your thoughts are, because we at least at Graticule here quite a bit and are putting our own investments in around using the latest and greatest ways to process free text with AI, and you can see many places to apply it. What are your thoughts about how that can help accelerate some of what we're trying to do in rare disease?
Oh, I think it's an incredible opportunity. And we ourselves are doing a lot of, experiments and trying to figure out new ways of getting information extracted, getting information aligned. It's historically a lot of the rare disease information that you might need is locked away in the notes. And so that's really helpful to extract information from the notes. But it's also even more than that. It's really helpful to sort of structure content together from all the different, places that key information is littered across the EHR. In such a way that provides that clinical signature that we can use to compare and contrast patients across different contexts. And so those signatures had been lacking largely because of a lack of access to, readily re-identifiable notes. And now we can extract that information and structure it together with the more structured information and share that information across sites. So I think that's really exciting. Also, just the clinical decision support opportunities. So, we've historically used what we refer to fondly as good old-fashioned AI, which is our semantic inference and using description logics to say, if you have co-occurrence of specific phenotypes, you might want to do this lab or this next evaluation. This is really helpful for multi-system disorders. For example, you're being seen by an ophthalmologist. They don't really know to look for liver signatures, but that multi-system disease might have a liver signature, right? So the LLM approaches can really dive in and help us, make those reveal those potential observations and next steps for clinical decision support much more readily apparent, not only from within one's own health system where these events are rare and it's historically not been very good, but now we can start to share them better across individual sites and then bring that clinical decision support back to the site. And so I think we're going to just see, I mean, we're in the middle of a healthcare revolution really with LLMs and especially in the rare disease space.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the upshot of what you're saying is the time is now to act from the sponsor side. And there's lots of opportunities to collaborate, to build out these new capabilities, even at a small scale. And then I think the big piece that I'd love to see, I know we've talked about it before, is just get it to scale, whether it's the government doing it or, you know, if life sciences companies have the focus, which is often the challenge or the risk tolerance to go through some learning, they can get the benefits of working with UNC, working with, networks of groups connected to all of us to build out the things that are necessary to improve um, their ability to serve patients. So,
I couldn't agree more. And I think, pre-competitive space where we share the infrastructure to build computable phenotypes and share, and share the cohorts. We share, again, that public service model, that public utility model. Everyone should be able to tap into the electricity, even if you're using it to run your freezer in one place and and you have, your air compressor for your, power washer and somewhere else, right? And so that kind of analogy, I think, is really where pharma companies need to go. We need to collectively build that public utility, and we need to push on our government to change the policies to let us do it.
well, great. Well, I love talking with you all the time, Miss Melissa. I wish we had more time. Um, so that this has been fun, and I hope for the folks who are listening, feel free to reach out with the emails, comments, thoughts for ways to apply some of the things that are going on to your own challenges. Um, and I think both of us are just excited to see what comes next and how.
Absolutely. It's been great being here today with you, Dan.
Thanks, Melissa. Catch you soon.
Okay, thanks so much.
Bye.